East and Europe, which Trump is signaling. Well, the NGOs, they mainly worked in the Middle East with the Arab Spring, and then we had the color revolutions across Europe, which were democratically elected governments were toppled. But now, of course, if US is pivoting away, I guess it would make sense and not contradictory to see the financing or Trump defunding a lot of these groups, which perpetuates conflicts and ties the Americans down. But if they are pivoting to Asia, that I guess is a good reason why we should be putting an eye on whether or not those activities are defunded. But are they? What are you seeing from your end? Not only are you located in Southeast Asia, but you've been following the NGO activity there quite closely as well.
As a matter of fact, I started geopolitical analysis because of my desire to raise awareness of what was happening here. I was in the U.S. Marines. I left the Marines in protest to the invasion of Iraq, the upcoming invasion of Iraq, and I literally moved to the other side of the planet, trying to get away from the U.S. I didn't want anything to do with their foreign policy. I didn't want to help contribute to it in any shape, form, or way. But what I noticed here is that the U.S. is extremely involved in interfering in the local government and in all kinds of ways, basically trying to capture the entire country, capturing the media, capturing and controlling the media, infiltrating the education system, approaching young people who are going into the legal fields, the media, politics, even business, and giving them these free exchange programs and scholarships to go to the US and basically indoctrinate them so that when they go back to their country, they're now plugged into this personal and professional network in the West. And they're very proud of that. They feel it's a great personal achievement. They're really exploiting human ego here. And they will pursue Western interests, even at the expense of their own country's interests, to stay plugged into those personal and professional networks. And I want people to look up it's on YouTube, it's on video sharing networks, the 4 to 5 hour, I mean, I know it's a long hearing, but there was a US Senate hearing for this USAID so-called defunding, and all throughout the hearing, and it was chaired by a Republican who supported the Trump administration's supposed defunding of the organization. And all throughout the hearing, they reiterated that they had not defunded all of these programs. They only defunded the programs dealing with DEI, transgender issues, other types of issues like that, these political wedge issues that the left and the right use to divide and distract people at home. And also try to create the same dynamic in a targeted country. They're only defunding that. Everything else is still being funded. All of the invasive, manipulative, interfering programs the US has been funding all along continue unabated all around the world. I can't even remember how many times the chair of the hearing said, we need USAID to be countering China and its Belt and Road Initiative, not talking about DEI or funding transgender operas around the world. So if people actually listen to what they're really saying, this isn't about defunding and stopping US interference abroad. It's making it more efficient, cutting out this political bloat that has been attached to it throughout the Biden administration, streamlining it, sharpening it, if you will, so that I could do a more efficient job of cutting down a targeted nation's sovereignty. So it's very important to go at least skip through it and listen to it and try to extract what they're really talking about versus the headlines and the sound bites people are citing. And I get it. People are aware of it. They're increasingly aware of it. And it upsets them and they want to see it end. And when they hear that it's being ended, they want to believe that. But you have to follow up. You have to actually make sure that it ended. I'm on the receiving end of it. So I have added incentive to check and see, are these organizations still open? Are they still active? Here in Thailand, where I'm based, they're all active. None of them have shut down. There were 1 or 2 programs that were temporarily, the funding was temporarily frozen, but the stream of money is still coming in. I will point something else out to people. I've been warning for years that because of growing awareness over USAID, NED, and even private foundations that work adjacent to them, like George Soros's Open Society. There's growing awareness of this across the general public around the world, and also inside governments who are pushing back with foreign agent laws, just like in Georgia, as a matter of fact. And so there has been growing awareness of this. The US sees this, and they have reacted by diversifying and rerouting funding from USAID, from NED, through different avenues. So the funding isn't stopping in many cases. It's being rerouted. It's being redistributed so it's harder to track, harder to expose, harder to raise awareness and opposition to it. So this has been happening for years. And I would say the last 1 or 2 years has become really hard. You know this organization is funded by the US government, but it is so hard to find the funding. And that was very deliberate because that they're reacting to this. So this isn't change for the better. This is a method, a tool being recamouflaged, reorganized, and continuing.
Well, I guess this is one of the challenges with Trump's very bombastic language is it grabs all the attention, which means people are either excited or they're horrified, and people tend to read into whatever he says. They see what they want to see effectively. So on one side they see, oh no, he's attacking our, NGO instruments of power to influence well the world, and the other side is no, he's finally dismantling the empire, removing these very illegitimate tools. So yeah, we're all either horrified or celebrating, but it does beg the question, though, why is it being done? And I think this is a key issue, at least to ask it, because one can present many different hypotheses. That is, he could be just worried about all the money, which means because the US is being bled dry. It could be ideology, as you mentioned, is a lot of these things like financing sex changes and LGBT programs in Guatemala. This very strange way to spend money during decline of an empire. This is not ideal, and we often see this as well. That ideology can result in infightings within a state. This was obviously Russiagate, but it was also in Britain. They had the Integrity Initiative, which was meant to manipulate, create consent through these clusters of academics, journalists. And anyways, it ended up turning on their own opposition. So you have the cost, you have possibly the ideology. This could be a reason for Trump to defund it. So a cynic in me would suspect that even though this is very much a legitimate source of power, but nonetheless, given his experiences in his first administration, he sees it as a constraint on power, something simply to remove. Others might see it as being winding down the empire, but I guess the reasoning is quite important. And if what you're saying is correct, that this is mainly about shifting focus to Asia and getting rid of all these ideological projects, then some people might be celebrating a bit too early. And I have to admit, I think I also got caught up a little bit in his language, because my first thought was, oh, finally we're going to get rid of these NGOs, which is causing so much problems and wars and conflicts and undermining of civil society. But why, I guess, is important. I don't see him necessarily walking away from empire, but these institutions, do you see any of them being preserved in Europe? Because you mentioned some of them are simply being rebranded. The old ones have been banned, so they're just funneling money through new fronts. Did you see this happening in Europe as well, or is it more of a pull out completely?
No, I don't think there's any. A lot of people are talking about a U.S.-European split. I mean, the European Union is an extension of American power, and why would they voluntarily ever give that up? They're not. And so looking at the programs in Europe, especially the programs the US uses to maintain the political capture of Europe, those are all going to stay in place. Another thing that I noticed is not just rerouting money through, supposedly private funds. People have to look at the history of US interference abroad and how the CIA, before there was a National Endowment for Democracy, used so-called private foundations as fronts to do all of this. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation are really prominent examples of this. foundations that still exist and are still used by the U.S. for this very purpose. So there was that, and there's a lot of that now being done all over again. Another aspect was the U.S., especially here. I watched this whole process unfold. People in Thailand were increasingly aware of the U.S. interfering in their internal political affairs, and it was causing blowback. There was anger at the U.S. government for doing this, and this was bipartisan. This happened all throughout the Obama administration, the last Trump administration, and the Biden administration. And people were catching on. So what the U.S. began doing was outsourcing it to Europe. There were European embassies visiting the protests, supporting the protesters, meeting with the protesters, because the Thai people really weren't associating Europe yet with this type of interference. It was American, and it was offensive when America did it. It seemed more benign when Europe was doing it. So this is an ongoing game the U.S. plays, is a constant process of reinventing it in a way that is believable and sustainable. So it's very important to keep an eye on that. Now, again, during the 4 to 5 hour Senate hearing, they even talked about how in the past, all the way back to Reagan and all these other administrations long since passed, how when there was a transition from one president to the other, they would look at USAID and they would say, what are all these programs doing? Get them out. And it was all about political wedge issues. So they took turns doing this. And there's a heavy element of that. This is just the process of keeping up the appearance of left, right, keeping people locked into this paradigm so they don't see through the entire thing and see what the U.S. as a whole system is doing. They're only focused on one side, scared and angry at one side and driven into the arms of the other side. This is the dynamic they want to maintain. So there's a heavy element of that. They're really, in terms of ideology, do we honestly believe that this is a driving factor in any U.S. presidential administration, or is this a tool to further manipulate, control, and mislead people?
Yeah, no, it's also very interesting. You said that this happened even before the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID, because yeah, I did research for a book I wrote on political propaganda, and it's quite interesting that there's a wide consensus in the literature that the US and UK had far more efficient propaganda throughout the Cold War than the Soviet Union. Not reflecting on being good or bad, it's just because the tools you have. Because in propaganda, the source credibility is important, as all communication theory suggests. The extent to which a message is accepted by the receiver depends very much on who's sending it. So if it's sent by someone who's seen to be objective or have altruistic ambitions, then yeah, it's more likely to be accepted. And yeah, the Soviet Union, everything was state-centric, while the British and Americans, they could use private organizations, charity, independent institutions, NGO. They could go through a lot of different avenues in order to obtain that source credibility. And this is also what made it very effective. And as Reagan also recognized when he established the National Endowment for Democracy back in '83 was this whole idea of hiding in plain sight. I mean, was great, a human rights organization. Now, it's not only you can't get caught, but even if someone criticizes it, it's well, it's legitimate. Democracy, freedom, something unites all people. Indeed, if we don't do this, then we are succumbing to the demands of authoritarian states. So suddenly, instead of hiding, it's almost an obligation, a responsibility to do this. And yeah, it doesn't seem to bother anyone that what they're actually doing, which is why it's interesting. People like you look at the details, because if we shift over to Ukraine, not only did these NGOs have a key role in toppling the government there in 2004 and also 2014, and then financing a lot of the media organizations, majority of them across Ukraine, to maintain its control and power. But even back in 2019, when Zelensky won, this massive peace mandate with 73% of the vote, the same NGOs which were financed in Ukraine openly threatened Zelensky. They put red lines. If you try to implement any of this, you will have political instability. essentially putting red lines. You can't negotiate with Russia without the West. You can't, the whole peace platform he put forward. You can't talk to Donbass. You can't make peace with the Russians. All of this will undermine our security. So this is what the non-governmental organizations do. They hijack the elections. They hijack the media. They hijack the election results. It's quite extraordinary. But